Daniel Martinez couldn't believe what he was seeing through his apartment window. A pristine white Mercedes SUV was parked diagonally across two spaces, including his designated spot that he'd paid extra for when signing his lease at Riverside Gardens. He stood there, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, watching as a well-dressed woman in her 50s casually strolled away from her poorly parked vehicle, designer handbag swinging from her arm as if she owned the entire parking lot. This wasn't just poor parking etiquette, this was a blatant disregard for basic human decency. And on today of all days, when he had a crucial client meeting in less than an hour, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this wild ride of a story. Trust me, this is just the beginning, and it gets so much more intense. Drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with someone who thinks parking rules don't apply to them. Daniel had spent the last 5 years building his consulting business from the ground up, working remotely with clients across the country. When he finally decided to leave behind the chaos of downtown living, Riverside Gardens seemed like the perfect choice. The modern apartment complex sat nestled in the quiet suburb of Oakwood Heights, offering a perfect balance of professional amenities and peaceful living. He'd specifically chosen a unit with a dedicated parking space, paying an additional premium to ensure he'd never have to worry about parking when rushing to virtual meetings or heading out to client presentations. The complex itself was a testament to modern suburban living, 3-story buildings arranged in a horseshoe pattern around meticulously maintained courtyards. Each resident had their assigned spot, clearly marked with their apartment number, a system that had worked flawlessly for the 6 months he'd lived there. Until today, until Patricia Reynolds decided that the rules didn't apply to her. Daniel hadn't wanted to get involved in apartment politics. He kept to himself, exchanged polite nods with his neighbors, and focused on his work. He wasn't the type to make waves or get caught up in residential drama. His time was valuable, his schedule carefully planned, and he had built his life around avoiding exactly this kind of pointless conflict. But as he stood there, watching his precious morning routine crumbling because someone had decided their convenience was more important than his right to park in his own spot, something inside him shifted. He set his coffee down, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe the driver had an emergency or was just making a quick stop. He'd approach this calmly, rationally, like the professional he was. After all, most problems could be solved with clear communication and mutual respect. The morning air was crisp as Daniel made his way down to the parking lot, his dress shoes clicking against the concrete steps. A few early risers were walking, their dogs or heading out for their morning jog, and he noticed James Chen from Unit 304 retrieving his mail. James gave him a knowing look, glancing between Daniel and the white Mercedes. That look told Daniel everything he needed to know. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. As he approached the vehicle, Daniel noticed something that made his blood pressure rise even further. A small placard sat on the dashboard, printed in what looked like expensive cardstock. Resident Parking Enforcement. Patricia Reynolds, Building. See Representative. He'd never heard of such a position, and he'd read his lease agreement thoroughly. There was no mention of parking enforcement representatives or any similar authority. He pulled out his phone and took several photos of the vehicle, making sure to capture how it was parked across 2 spaces, including his clearly marked spot. He'd learned long ago that documentation was essential when dealing with any kind of dispute. As he was taking the pictures, he heard the distinct sound of heels clicking on pavement. "Is there a problem?" The voice was sharp, cultured, dripping, with the kind of artificial politeness that barely masked underlying contempt. Daniel turned to find himself face to face with the woman he'd seen earlier. Patricia Reynolds stood before him, perfectly coiffed blonde hair framing a face that might have been attractive if it wasn't set in such a condescending expression. "Yes, actually," Daniel replied, keeping his voice level and professional. "You're parked in my assigned space, number 247. He gestured to the clearly painted numbers on the asphalt. Patricia's lips curved into what might have been meant as a smile but looked more like a sneer. "Oh, you must be new here," she said, though. Daniel had a feeling she knew exactly how long he'd been a resident. "As the parking enforcement representative for Building C, I sometimes need to occupy multiple spaces while conducting my inspections." Daniel felt his eyebrows rise involuntarily. "I wasn't aware we had parking enforcement representatives. Could you direct me to where that's documented in the lease agreement?" The question seemed to catch Patricia off guard, but only for a moment. Her smile tightened, and she reached into her designer bag, pulling out what looked like a laminated card. "I've been handling parking issues in this complex for 5 years," she said, holding up the card that appeared to be some sort of self-made identification. "If you have concerns, you're welcome to file a complaint with the management office. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important matters to attend to." She turned to walk away, clearly considering the matter closed. Daniel felt something snap inside him, not in anger, but in determination. He dealt with enough corporate politics to recognize a power play when he saw one. This wasn't about parking. This was about control. "Actually," he called after her, "I have a client meeting in 45 minutes and I need access to my parking space, the one I pay for monthly, the one you're currently blocking." Patricia paused, then turned back slowly. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Martinez? Daniel Martinez. And no, I'm not threatening you. I'm simply stating a fact. You're parked illegally in my space, and I need you to move your vehicle." The temperature in the air seemed to drop several degrees as Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice now sharp enough to cut glass, "I don't appreciate your tone. Perhaps we need to have a discussion about resident conduct and respect for authority figures in this community." Daniel almost laughed. Almost. "Authority figures? I'd be happy to discuss this with the actual property management. In fact, let's do that right now." He pulled out his phone, making a show of pulling up the management office's number. Something flickered across Patricia's face, uncertainty perhaps, or anger at being challenged, but she quickly masked it with another cold smile. "That won't be necessary. I'll move my vehicle, but we'll be discussing this further. Welcome to Riverside Gardens, Mr. Martinez." She emphasized his name in a way that made it clear this wasn't over. As she walked to her Mercedes, Daniel caught movement from the corner of his eye. James Chen was still by the mailboxes, pretending to sort through his mail while obviously watching the entire exchange. Several other residents had paused in their morning routines to observe the confrontation. Daniel had a feeling. This wasn't the first time they'd witnessed something like this, but perhaps it was the first time someone had stood their ground. Patricia's Mercedes roared to life, and she backed out of the spaces with deliberate slowness, her eyes locked on Daniel in her rearview mirror. As she pulled away, she rolled down her window. "Do enjoy your client meeting, Mr. Martinez. I'm sure we'll be seeing much more of each other." The threat in her voice was unmistakable. Daniel watched her drive away, already knowing that this was just the beginning. He dealt with enough office politics and corporate power plays to recognize when someone was preparing for war. Patricia. Reynolds had clearly grown accustomed to wielding her self-appointed authority without challenge, and he had just publicly questioned that authority. As he walked back to his apartment to grab his laptop bag, James Chen approached him. "Hey, man," James said, glancing around to make sure Patricia was truly gone. "Just watch yourself, okay? Patricia's been pulling this kind of stuff for years." Most people either give in or move out. Daniel nodded, appreciating the warning but feeling even more resolved. Thanks for the heads up, but I'm not going anywhere, and I'm definitely not giving in to someone's made-up authority. Back in his apartment, as he gathered his things for the client meeting, Daniel's mind was already working through scenarios and strategies. He'd built his consulting business by helping companies navigate complex personalities and power dynamics. He knew how people like Patricia operated. They relied on others backing down, on the community's fear of confrontation, on the general human desire to avoid conflict. But Daniel Martinez wasn't most people. He believed in systems, in documentation, in methodically dismantling problems piece by piece. If Patricia Reynolds wanted to play games with parking spaces and fabricated authority, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong person to target. He grabbed his laptop bag, checked his tie in the mirror, and headed out for his meeting. But as he walked to his car, now safely parked in his rightful space, he was already planning his next moves. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This was about standing up to the kind of petty tyranny that thrived when good people did nothing. The retaliation began sooner than Daniel expected. The very next morning, as he headed down to his car, he found a bright orange violation notice plastered across his windshield. The paper, printed on what appeared to be official letterhead from the Riverside Gardens Parking Authority, cited him for aggressive and threatening behavior toward parking enforcement personnel and failure to maintain proper vehicle positioning within designated spaces. Daniel carefully peeled the notice off his windshield, noting how the adhesive seemed specifically chosen to be difficult to remove, leaving a stubborn residue on the glass. He pulled out his phone, photographed the notice from every angle, and then began the tedious process of cleaning his windshield. As he worked, he noticed a familiar figure watching from a second-floor balcony. Patricia Reynolds stood there, coffee cup in hand, that same self-satisfied smile playing across her lips. The violation notice demanded a $100 fine payable directly to Patricia's home address. The document was impressively official-looking, complete with watermarks and a seal that, upon closer inspection, appeared to be completely fabricated. Daniel had to admire the attention to detail. If he hadn't spent years reviewing corporate documentation, he might have actually believed it was legitimate. As he finished cleaning his windshield, Maria Rodriguez, the actual building manager, emerged from the office. She was a practical woman in her 40s who typically kept to herself, but today she seemed to be making a deliberate path toward Daniel. "Mr. Martinez?" she called out, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you have a moment?" Daniel folded the violation notice and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Of course, Ms. Rodriguez. I'm guessing this is about yesterday's parking situation." Maria glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Look, I know Patricia can be difficult. She's been here longer than I have, and she's friends with the property owner's wife. Just try not to antagonize her. Most residents find it easier to just work around her." Work around someone who's essentially extorting money from residents with fake violations. Daniel kept his voice equally low but firm. "That doesn't seem like a solution." Maria's expression tightened. "Mr. Martinez, I understand your frustration, but Patricia has a way of making life very uncomfortable for people who challenge her. Last year, a resident tried to report her to the police for harassment. Within a month, their car had mysterious scratches. Their mail started disappearing, and eventually they broke their lease just to get away." Daniel absorbed this information, his consultant's mind already cataloging it as valuable intelligence. "Thank you for the warning, Ms. Rodriguez. But I have to ask, as the building manager, don't you have the authority to stop this?" Maria's Eyes darted toward Patricia's balcony, where the self-appointed parking enforcer was still watching their interaction. It's, complicated. Just be careful, Mr. Martinez. Patricia doesn't forget when someone challenges her authority. As Maria walked away, Daniel pulled out his phone again. This time, opening his notes app, he created a new folder titled Riverside Gardens Documentation and began recording everything that had happened so far, including his conversation with Maria. Years of corporate consulting had taught him the value of maintaining detailed records. He was about to head to his car when James Chen jogged up, dressed in his hospital scrubs. "Hey, got a second?" James glanced nervously at Patricia's balcony. "Not here, coffee shop around the corner." 20 minutes later, Daniel sat across from James at a quiet table in the back of the Daily Grind, listening as his neighbor painted a picture of Patricia Reynolds' reign of terror over Riverside Gardens. "She started small," James explained, stirring his coffee absently. "Just occasional comments about parking alignment, claiming spaces needed to be kept open for inspections. But over the years, she's built this whole system. Those violation notices, she has them professionally printed. The fines keep getting bigger, and people pay them because they're afraid of what she'll do if they don't. And nobody's ever successfully stood up to her?" Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. James shook his head. "A few have tried. Remember what Maria told you about the scratched car? That was just the start. Patricia has this network of friends in the complex, mostly people who are either scared of her or benefit from her protection. They help her keep tabs on everyone. If you cross her, suddenly your visitors' cars get towed, or you start getting noise complaints filed against you, or your packages disappear from the front office." Daniel leaned back, processing this information. "So she's built herself a little fiefdom, using fear and intimidation to maintain control, all over parking spaces." "It's not just about the parking anymore," James said, leaning forward. "That's just her weapon of choice. It's about power. She needs to feel in control, and the parking enforcement thing gives her an excuse to monitor and manipulate everyone in the complex." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed with an email notification from the property management company. The subject line read, "Urgent, multiple resident complaints, Unit 247. His jaw tightened as he opened the message. "Dear Mr. Martinez," he read aloud quietly to James, "we have received several complaints regarding aggressive behavior and parking violations associated with your unit. Multiple residents have reported feeling threatened by your confrontational attitude. As per our lease agreement, repeated violations may result in punitive action, including potential lease termination." James winced. "Yeah, that's her other tactic. She gets her little group to file simultaneous complaints, makes it look like there's a pattern of behavior." Daniel set his phone down, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. James eyed him warily. "Why do I feel like you're not as worried as you should be?" "Because," Daniel said, pulling out his laptop, "Patricia Reynolds isn't the only one who knows how to build a case. She's used to dealing with residents who either give in or run away, but I spend my days helping companies navigate hostile takeovers and corporate power plays. This is actually kind of refreshing. The tactics are the same, just on a smaller scale." He opened a new document and began typing. "The key is documentation. Everything gets recorded. Everything gets time-stamped. Everything gets backed up. Every interaction, every false violation, every retaliatory action. Build the pattern, establish the history, and then..." "Then what?" James asked, leaning forward with interest. "Then you use their own system against them. Patricia's power comes from making people feel isolated and helpless. But I'm willing to bet there are plenty of other residents who are tired of living under her self-appointed authority." As if to prove his point, an elderly couple at a nearby table had been trying not to obviously listen to their conversation. The woman finally turned around, her face a mix of hope and concern. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said, introducing herself as Eleanor Wilson. "My husband Robert and we live in Building B. That woman had our grandson's car towed last Christmas because she claimed visitor parking was suspended for the holidays. Cost us $300 to get it out of impound, and when we tried to complain to management, suddenly our water heater started having issues. No one could ever prove anything, but..." Daniel smiled warmly at Eleanor. "Would you be willing to write down your experience with dates, if you can remember them?" Robert Wilson joined the conversation, pulling their table closer. "You really think you can do something about her?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that it's time someone did, but I'm going to need help. Not just statements about past incidents, but people willing to document what's happening now. Because if I'm right, Patricia's just getting started." His phone buzzed again, another email, this time from an unnamed resident, warning him that his car had been seen with its wheels slightly over the parking space line. The threat was clear. Every minor infraction would be noticed and reported. Daniel showed the email to James and the Wilsons. "See? She's escalating already. She needs to show everyone what happens when someone challenges her authority, which means..." "She's going to get sloppy," James finished, understanding dawning on his face. "The more she comes after you, the more evidence she gives us," Daniel confirmed. "But it's going to get worse before it gets better. Are you all sure you want to be involved?" The Wilsons exchanged a look, then Eleanor reached over and patted Daniel's hand. "Dear, we're in our 70s. We're too old to be afraid of parking. Lot bullies. Tell us what you need." For the next hour, they developed a plan. The Wilsons had a clear view of the parking lot from their unit and agreed to keep a log of Patricia's activities. James, who worked different shifts at the hospital, would document any late night or early morning incidents. Daniel would continue to be the primary target, drawing Patricia's attention while building their case. As they wrapped up their impromptu strategy session, Daniel's phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. "Noticed you're making friends at the daily grind. Hope you're not planning anything foolish. Would hate to see your lease terminated over multiple violations." Daniel showed the message to the others. "She's watching. Probably has someone in the coffee shop reporting back to her." "Aren't you worried?" James asked. "She's obviously targeting you now." Daniel pocketed his phone, gathering his things. "The difference between Patricia and me is that she thinks intimidation is power. I know better. Real power comes from community, from people standing together against bullies. She's about to learn that lesson the hard way." As they left the coffee shop, Daniel caught sight of a familiar white Mercedes cruising slowly past. Patricia didn't look their way, but her message was clear. She was watching. Always watching. "Game on," Daniel muttered under his breath, already mentally drafting his response to the property management company's email. Patricia Reynolds had spent years building her little kingdom of fear, but she'd never faced someone who understood power dynamics as well as she did. She thought she was starting a war of intimidation. Instead, she was walking right into a carefully planned dismantling of her entire power structure. The next morning would bring more violation notices, more complaints, more attempts at intimidation. But for the first time in years, the residents of Riverside Gardens were starting to feel something they'd almost forgotten. Hope. The parking lot tyrant's reign was about to face its first real challenge, and Daniel Martinez was just getting started. As he walked back to his apartment, Daniel noticed new signs posted around the parking lot. All vehicles subject to inspection by parking enforcement. The signs hadn't been there that morning, and they lacked any official property management logos. Patricia was marking her territory, showing everyone that she was still in control. But now, as he looked around, he saw more than just signs. He saw the slight nod from an elderly resident walking his dog, The quick smile from a young mother hustling her kids to the car. The determined look from James as he headed to his shift. People were watching, waiting, ready to take back their community from someone who had held them hostage with fear for far too long. Daniel took a picture of the new signs, adding them to his growing documentation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tactics, new attempts to break his resolve. But Patricia Reynolds was about to learn a valuable lesson. Sometimes the person you choose to intimidate turns out to be the one person who knows exactly how to take you down. Daniel awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. The screen displayed multiple messages from James Chen, each one more urgent than the last. Throwing on a robe, he rushed to his window, already knowing he wouldn't like what he saw. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, highlighting the scene below in stark detail. His car sat exactly where he'd left it, but it was now completely boxed in by 3 vehicles, none of which belonged in those spaces. A sleek white Mercedes SUV occupied the space to the left, while a red Jeep and a black BMW effectively blocked any possibility of pulling out. All 3 vehicles displayed the same parking enforcement placard that Patricia Reynolds had created, marking them as part of her self-appointed authority. Daniel's jaw tightened as he noticed a small group of residents gathering at the edges of the parking lot, phones out, documenting the situation. Patricia's influence might have been strong, but she'd inadvertently created exactly the kind of visible drama that would work against her. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Eleanor. "Wilson, dear, you need to come down here. Patricia's making quite the show of writing up violations. Says she's going to have all 3 cars blocking you towed for improper parking, then bill you for the removal costs since your dangerous parking job forced her to take emergency measures." Daniel dressed quickly, grabbing his laptop bag and camera. As he headed downstairs, he could hear Patricia's voice carrying across the parking lot, sharp and authoritative as she addressed the growing crowd of onlookers. "This is exactly why we need strict parking enforcement," she was saying, gesturing dramatically at Daniel's perfectly parked car. "When residents refuse to follow proper protocols, it creates hazardous conditions for everyone. As your parking enforcement officer, I cannot allow such blatant disregard for community safety." Daniel emerged from the building just as Patricia was finishing her speech. The morning sun caught her perfectly styled hair, creating what might have been a halo effect, if not for the cold calculation in her eyes. She dressed for the occasion in what looked like an expensive pantsuit, complete with a badge-like pin on her lapel that read RGPE, Riverside Gardens Parking Enforcement, he assumed. "Mr. Martinez," she called out, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "I'm so glad you're here. We need to discuss the numerous violations your vehicle has accumulated, as well as the emergency measures that had to be taken this morning." Daniel approached calmly, phone recording in his pocket. "Interesting situation. We have here, Patricia, 3 vehicles, all displaying your unauthorized parking enforcement placards, blocking an illegally parked car. I'm curious, how exactly does this improve community safety?" A whisper ran through the gathered crowd. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Martinez, if you had bothered to read the updated parking guidelines I distributed last week, you would understand that official enforcement vehicles may be positioned as needed to address parking infractions." "Updated guidelines?" Daniel pulled out his phone, making a show of checking his email. "I don't seem to have received those. Could you point me to where these guidelines are officially documented in our lease agreements?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "As I've explained before, parking enforcement regulations are managed separately from standard lease documentation. Now, regarding the matter at hand, your vehicle has been cited for 3 violations: improper alignment within the space, unauthorized modification of a parking zone, and creating an obstruction hazard." Daniel looked pointedly at the three vehicles boxing in his car. Speaking of obstruction hazards, those vehicles are properly authorized enforcement units, Patricia snapped, her composure cracking slightly. The tow truck will be here within the hour to remove your vehicle, and as per Section 7, 3 of the parking guidelines, all costs will be billed to your unit. That's fascinating, Daniel said, pulling out his laptop and opening it on the hood of his car, because I have here the actual property management guidelines for parking enforcement directly from the corporate office. Would you like to show everyone where it authorizes you to create hazardous situations by blocking in legally parked vehicles? Patricia took half a step forward, then caught herself. The crowd had grown larger, and more phones were out, recording the confrontation. She forced her smile back into place. Mr. Martinez, if you have concerns about official parking enforcement procedures, you're welcome to file a complaint through proper channels. Oh, I intend to, Daniel replied, typing as he spoke. In fact, I'm copying everyone on this email to corporate management right now, including photos of this situation and documentation of your unofficial parking enforcement operation. I'm sure they'll be very interested in how their property is being managed. The color drained from Patricia's face. For years, she had maintained her power through a careful balance of intimidation and plausible deniability. But now, with dozens of witnesses recording her actions and clear documentation being sent up the corporate chain, that balance was starting to tip. "You're making a serious mistake," she hissed, dropping all pretense of professional courtesy. "This community has rules, order. People like you who think they can just come in and disrupt established protocols." Actually, a new voice cut in, "I believe Mr. Martinez is correct about the parking regulations." Steve Parker, who Daniel recognized as the property's legal advisor, stepped forward from the crowd. He held up his phone, displaying an email. "I've just received several complaints about unauthorized parking enforcement activities, including allegations of harassment and extortion through fraudulent fines." Patricia's face went from pale to flushed in an instant. "Steve, you know very well that I've been handling parking enforcement here for years. The property owner himself approved my position." "Did he?" Steve asked mildly. "Because I have here the official property management documentation, and there's no record of any authorized private parking enforcement program. What I do see are numerous complaints about unauthorized fines, intimidation of residents, and now, this rather concerning situation with blocked vehicles." The crowd had grown silent, watching the confrontation unfold. Daniel noticed James Chen quietly circulating, gathering contact information from witnesses. The Wilsons stood at the edge of the group, Eleanor filming everything on her iPad with surprising steadiness for someone her age. Patricia's eyes darted around, taking in the scene. For the first time, she seemed to realize that she had lost control of the narrative. Her carefully constructed system of fear and intimidation was crumbling in the harsh light of public scrutiny. "This is ridiculous," she declared, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling the actual police. We'll see how they feel about this disruption of community order." "Excellent idea," Daniel said, still typing on his laptop. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in these records of fraudulent fines, unauthorized vehicle detention, and what appears to be a pattern of organized harassment. Should we wait for them together?" Patricia's hand froze over her phone. The mask of authority she had worn for so long was cracking, revealing the uncertainty beneath. She had built her power on the assumption that no one would ever truly challenge her, that fear would keep residents in line. But now, faced with actual documentation and witnesses, that power was evaporating. "Move the vehicles," she snapped at someone in the crowd. A young man who had often served as her unofficial assistant hesitated, looking between Patricia and the growing number of witnesses recording the scene. "Actually," Steve Parker interjected, "I would recommend leaving everything exactly as it is until we can properly document this situation. Corporate management is sending a representative, and I believe they'll want to see firsthand how unauthorized parking enforcement activities have been conducted." The next hour unfolded like a carefully orchestrated demolition of Patricia's authority. Residents who had remained silent for years began stepping forward, sharing their stories with Steve Parker. The Wilsons distributed copies of their meticulously kept records of Patricia's activities. James Chen coordinated with other residents to compile a digital archive of photos, videos, and correspondence, documenting years of harassment and unauthorized fines. Through it all, Patricia stood rigidly by her Mercedes, watching as her carefully constructed kingdom crumbled. When the corporate representative finally arrived, accompanied by 2 police officers, she attempted one last time to maintain her facade of authority. "This is all a misunderstanding," she began, smoothing her jacket. "As the community's parking enforcement officer..." "Ms. Reynolds," the corporate representative cut in, "we have no record of any authorized parking enforcement position at this property. What we do have are dozens of complaints about unauthorized fines, harassment, and now this clear example of vehicle detention without proper authority." The police officers, after reviewing the situation and taking statements from multiple residents, approached Patricia. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to move these vehicles immediately. Additionally, we'll be taking reports regarding allegations of harassment and fraudulent representation of authority." Baita, as Patricia's unauthorized enforcement vehicles were moved one by one, Daniel stood quietly, continuing to document everything. He had known from the start that someone like Patricia could only be defeated by turning her own tactics against her, not through force or confrontation, but by meticulously exposing the truth of her actions to the light of day. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy had changed. Residents who had lived in fear of Patricia's retaliation were now talking openly, sharing their experiences, forming connections that would help ensure no one could ever again establish such a system of intimidation in their community. Steve Parker approached Daniel as the last police officer finished taking statements. "That was well handled," he said quietly. "Most people would have tried to fight force with force. You understood that the real power was in documentation and community action." Daniel nodded, watching as Patricia got into her Mercedes, her movements stiff with suppressed rage. People like that rely on isolation and fear. They make each person feel like they're alone in standing up to the abuse. Once people realize they're not alone, that kind of power falls apart pretty quickly. As Patricia's car disappeared around the corner, Eleanor Wilson approached, still holding her iPad. "I sent everything we recorded to that nice corporate representative," she said with satisfaction. "Along with our records from the past 3 years, I don't think Ms. Reynolds will be implementing any more unauthorized parking regulations." The aftermath of the morning's confrontation rippled through Riverside Gardens like a cleansing wave. The corporate management company quickly issued a statement clarifying that no private parking enforcement had ever been authorized, and that all fines issued by Patricia Reynolds were fraudulent and would be refunded. A proper system for handling parking issues would be implemented through the official management office. But perhaps more importantly, the community itself had changed. The invisible walls that Patricia had built between neighbors, the atmosphere of suspicion and fear she had cultivated, began to dissolve. People who had hurried past each other without making eye contact now stopped to chat. The community that had existed before Patricia's reign of terror began to re-emerge, stronger for having finally stood together against intimidation. Daniel returned to his apartment that evening to find a notice under his door. not one of Patricia's unauthorized violations, but an official letter from corporate management. They were establishing a resident advisory committee to help develop fair and transparent policies for the community. His name had been suggested by multiple residents as someone who should serve on the committee. He smiled, setting the letter aside. He hadn't come to Riverside Gardens looking to get involved in community politics. He had just wanted a quiet place to live and work. But sometimes, he reflected, the most important changes come not from seeking power, but from being willing to stand up to those who abuse it. His phone buzzed with a message from James. Parking lot feels different already. Amazing what happens when people stop being afraid. Daniel looked out his window at the parking lot below. The unauthorized signs had been removed, and residents were going about their evening routines without the constant fear of Patricia's surveillance. It was a small change, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things. But as he watched his neighbors moving freely through their community, he knew it was a change that mattered. The war over parking spaces had been about much more than just parking. It had been about power, about community, about the choice between living in fear and standing up for what's right. Patricia Reynolds had tried to build a kingdom on fear and intimidation, only to discover that true power comes not from controlling others, but from bringing them together. The corporate investigation into Patricia Reynolds' unauthorized parking enforcement scheme had barely begun when the real storm hit. Daniel was reviewing some client documents late one evening when an urgent knock at his door broke his concentration. Opening it, he found Maria Rodriguez, the building manager, looking uncharacteristically flustered. "You need to see this," she said, thrusting a tablet into his hands. On the screen was an email from what appeared to be an anonymous resident, addressed to the entire Riverside Gardens community. The message contained dozens of photos, carefully selected and edited snippets of security camera footage showing Daniel in what appeared to be heated arguments with various residents. "She's had these queued up," Maria explained, her voice tight with concern. "Patricia's been editing security footage for months, building a case against anyone who might challenge her. But now she's desperate, and she's starting to use everything she's gathered." Daniel scrolled through the email, noting how skillfully the images had been curated. Without context, they painted a picture of him as an aggressive, confrontational resident who posed a threat to community safety. Each photo was accompanied by a detailed description of alleged incidents, most of which were completely fabricated or grossly misrepresented. "This went out to everyone?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Maria nodded grimly. "Every resident, the management company, local police, even some local news outlets. She's trying to control the narrative before the corporate investigation can proceed." Before Daniel could respond, his phone began buzzing with notifications. The email was already generating responses, creating exactly the kind of chaos Patricia had intended. Some residents were expressing concern about safety, others were defending him, and a heated debate was unfolding in the community's online forum. "She's good," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Maria. "This isn't just retaliation, it's a preemptive strike. If she can paint me as the aggressor, anything I've documented against her becomes suspect." A new message popped up on his phone. James Chen. "Emergency meeting at the Wilsons' apartment. Now, bring your laptop." Daniel grabbed his computer and followed Maria across the complex to Building B. The Wilsons' apartment had become an unofficial command center for what Robert Wilson jokingly called the parking resistance. Eleanor had converted their dining room table into a documentation station, with multiple tablets displaying security feeds and a detailed timeline of Patricia's activities posted on the wall. James was already there, along with Steve Parker, and several other residents who had been helping to build the case against Patricia. Eleanor Wilson sat at her computer, her usual warm smile replaced by a look of determined concentration. "She's trying to drown us in chaos," Steve said as Daniel set up his laptop. Classic tactic, when faced with legitimate accusations, creates so much noise and confusion that the truth gets lost in the shuffle. "But why now?" James asked, pacing nervously. "The corporate investigation was already underway. This feels like desperation," Daniel finished. "She's not just trying to discredit me. Look at these timestamps on the security footage. Some of these go back months, showing interactions with other residents. She's trying to establish a pattern of community disruption that predates her parking enforcement scheme being exposed." Eleanor turned from her computer. "She just posted another update. Now she's claiming she has evidence that we've been conspiring to harass her, that her parking enforcement was a legitimate response to ongoing community safety concerns." Daniel watched as more messages flooded the community forum. Patricia's supporters, whether genuine or intimidated into compliance, were amplifying her narrative. The carefully documented case they had built against her was being buried under an avalanche of manufactured outrage and carefully edited evidence. "We need to respond," James said urgently. "If we don't counter this now—" "No," Daniel interrupted, a plan already forming in his mind. "That's exactly what she wants. If we rush to defend ourselves, we validate her narrative. She's expecting us to react emotionally, to get drawn into a public argument that will only create more chaos." Steve nodded slowly, understanding dawning on his face. "You're right. The more we engage directly, the more ammunition we give her." So what do we do?" Maria asked, looking between them. "We can't just let her control the story." Daniel opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "We don't fight the chaos. We don't engage with the accusations. Instead, we do something she won't expect. We go silent, completely silent, and we let her keep talking." "I don't understand," Eleanor said, frowning. "How does staying silent help us?" "Because Patricia's power has always come from creating drama and confusion," Daniel explained. "She's expecting us to fight back, to create exactly the kind of conflict that will support her narrative about community disruption. But if we don't react, if we give her nothing to work with, she'll have to keep escalating," Steve finished. "Catching on, and the more she escalates without any response, the more desperate and obvious her tactics become," Daniel confirmed. "Right now, she's trying to paint us as the aggressors. But if we step back completely, document everything but respond to nothing, she'll have to keep pushing harder to get a reaction, and eventually, she'll overplay her hand," Maria said softly, "just like she did with the parking blockade." Daniel nodded, continuing to type. "Exactly, but we need everyone on board. No responses to her emails, no arguments in the community forum, no engagement at all. We document everything, but we don't react. Can everyone commit to that?" The beer room was quiet for a moment as they considered the strategy. It went against every instinct to stay silent in the face of such blatant manipulation. But they had all seen how Patricia operated. She thrived on conflict, on creating situations that forced people to react emotionally. "I'm in," James said finally. "But what about the corporate investigation? Won't our silence look like an admission of guilt?" "Not if we do this right," Steve replied, pulling out his phone. "I can reach out to the investigators privately, let them know what's happening and why we're choosing not to engage publicly. In fact, our restraint in the face of these accusations might actually strengthen our case." Eleanor stood up, her expression determined. "I'll spread the word to our other supporters. Quietly, of course. But people need to understand why we're not responding." As they coordinated their non-response strategy, Daniel's phone buzzed with another notification. Patricia had just posted yet another update. this time claiming to have video evidence of him threatening her during their first confrontation over the parking space. The footage, conveniently, was being processed and would be shared soon. "She's already escalating," he noted, showing the others. "She knows her initial attack didn't get the reaction she wanted, so she's pushing harder, making bigger claims. Let's see how far she'll go when she's not getting any pushback." Over the next few days, Patricia's campaign of accusations and edited evidence continued to escalate. Each new post became more dramatic, each claim more outlandish. She posted carefully edited security footage that showed Daniel in various confrontations, but without the context that would have revealed her role in creating those situations. But true to their strategy, the parking resistance maintained complete silence. They documented everything, building a comprehensive record of her increasingly desperate attempts to provoke a response, but they didn't engage. No matter how inflammatory her accusations became, they kept their focus on quietly gathering evidence. The effect was noticeable. Without the expected pushback, Patricia's posts began to take on a frantic edge. She started making claims that were easily disproven, sharing edited photos that even her supporters could see had been manipulated. Her carefully crafted narrative began to show cracks as she pushed harder and harder for a reaction that never came. 1 week into their silence campaign, Daniel received an unexpected visit from Officer Thompson, the same police officer who had responded to the parking blockade incident. "Interesting situation you've got here," Thompson said, settling into a chair in Daniel's living room. "We've received numerous complaints from Ms. Reynolds about harassment and threats, but when we review the evidence she's provided, something doesn't add up." Daniel nodded but said nothing, maintaining their strategy of minimal engagement. Thompson watched him thoughtfully for a moment before continuing. "You know, in my experience, people who are actually being harassed tend to want to tell their side of the story. They don't usually maintain complete silence in the face of accusations, unless they're letting someone's actions speak for themselves," Daniel finished quietly. Thompson smiled slightly. "Exactly. We've been watching Ms. Reynolds, escalating claims with interest. The more outlandish they become, without any response from you or your neighbors, the more obvious the pattern becomes. It's actually quite an effective strategy." "I appreciate your insight, officer," Daniel replied carefully. "Is there something specific you need from me today?" "Actually, yes. We've been building our own case regarding Ms. Reynolds' unauthorized enforcement activities and fraudulent fines. Your documentation of these incidents, combined with her recent behavior, has painted a very clear picture. We'll need formal statements from you and your neighbors, but I wanted to give you a heads up. We're moving forward with charges." This was a development Daniel hadn't expected so soon. Their strategy of non-engagement had been designed to let Patricia discredit herself, but they hadn't anticipated that law enforcement would move this quickly. "What kind of charges?" he asked, breaking their silence only because this was an official police matter. "Fraud, for starters," Thompson replied. "The unauthorized fines alone constitute a significant pattern of deception, but there's also harassment, creating false official documents, and potential extortion charges related to her parking enforcement scheme. Her recent campaign of edited security footage and false accusations has actually helped establish a clear pattern of deliberate manipulation." As if on cue, Daniel's phone buzzed with another community alert. Patricia had just posted what she claimed was definitive evidence of a conspiracy against her. A series of photos showing Daniel and his neighbors meeting in the Wilsons' apartment. The photos were real, but her interpretation was pure fantasy, painting their documentation sessions as meetings to plot against her. "Perfect timing," Thompson said, glancing at the post. "She's making our case for us. By the way, we've received the complete unedited security footage from the property management company. The contrast between the actual footage and her edited versions is illuminating. After Thompson left, Daniel called an emergency meeting of their group. As they gathered in the Wilsons' apartment, the same room featured in Patricia's latest accusations, he shared the news about the pending charges. "So our silence strategy worked even better than we planned," James said, looking both relieved and surprised. "It did," Daniel confirmed, "but we need to maintain it for a bit longer. The police have enough to move forward with charges, but Patricia doesn't know that yet, and based on her patterns, she'll make one final, desperate attempt to regain control," Steve finished. "Probably something big, something public." "Exactly. And when she does, we need to be ready to document everything while continuing to give her nothing to work with." They didn't have to wait long. The next morning, residents of Riverside Gardens awoke to find their cars plastered with official-looking notices. Patricia had created what appeared to be a private security company, complete with a professional logo and legitimate-seeming documentation. The notices declared that due to ongoing safety concerns, all parking spaces would now be subject to mandatory security checks with substantial fees for any violations. It was a bold move. Instead of backing down in the face of investigation, she was attempting to legitimize her unauthorized enforcement by creating a corporate facade. The notices included registration forms for residents to submit their vehicle information, along with substantial security deposit requirements. "She's getting desperate," Maria observed as they documented the latest development, creating a fake security company demanding deposits. "She's practically daring someone to stop her, because that's exactly what she wants," Daniel replied. "She's trying to force a confrontation, to create a situation so outrageous that we have to respond, but we're not going to give her that satisfaction." Instead of engaging with Patricia's latest scheme, they simply continued their documentation. Photos of the notices were added to their evidence file. Copies were forwarded to the police and corporate investigators, but no one confronted her. No one posted angry responses in the community forum. No one took any action that would give her the reaction she craved. The final act of Patricia's desperate attempt to maintain control came 3 days later. Residents arrived in the parking lot to find orange cones and caution tape blocking off entire sections of the parking area. Patricia, dressed in what appeared to be a security uniform, complete with a badge that looked remarkably official, was directing traffic and informing people that their parking privileges had been suspended pending security clearance. This time, she had hired several people to act as her security team, all wearing similar uniforms and carrying clipboards. They were approaching residents, demanding to see documentation and attempting to issue citations for various invented violations. Daniel watched from his window as the scene unfolded. Patricia had finally pushed too far, creating a situation that was so obviously fraudulent that even her most loyal supporters were beginning to question her actions. As residents arrived for work, many simply drove past her makeshift checkpoints, ignoring her attempts to assert authority. The corporate management company, alerted by multiple residents, arrived within the hour. They were accompanied by actual police officers who quickly began dismantling Patricia's security theater. Her hired helpers, realizing they had been drawn into a potentially illegal operation, quickly abandoned their posts. Patricia stood alone in the middle of the parking lot, still clutching her clipboard, as Officer Thompson approached her. The conversation was brief, ending with Patricia being escorted to a police car. The charges had expanded beyond simple fraud and harassment. Impersonating security personnel and attempting to extort money through a fake security company had pushed her actions firmly into criminal territory. As Patricia was driven away, Daniel finally broke his silence, but not in the way anyone expected. He walked down to the parking lot, where residents were gathered in small groups, discussing the morning's events. Instead of joining in the conversations about Patricia's downfall, he simply began helping to remove the cones and caution tape, restoring the parking lot to its normal state. Others joined him, working quietly to erase the physical evidence of Patricia's final power grab. There was no need for discussion, no need for dramatic declarations of victory. The simple act of reclaiming their community space said everything that needed to be said. Later that evening, as the sun set over Riverside Gardens, Daniel sat on his balcony, watching residents come and go freely, parking without fear of arbitrary enforcement or fraudulent fines. The community had changed in ways that went beyond just parking spaces. People were talking more, helping each other, creating the kind of neighborhood that Patricia's reign of fear had nearly destroyed. His phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Wilson. "Community meeting tomorrow. They want you to help draft new parking guidelines. Real ones this time." Daniel smiled, typing back a simple, "I'll be there." The battle over parking spaces had revealed something important about power. Those who seek to control others through fear and intimidation eventually destroy themselves. True authority comes not from enforcement and threats, but from building trust and working together for the common good. The parking lots of Riverside Gardens were finally just parking lots again, no longer a battlefield for one person's need to control others. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. 2 weeks had passed since Patricia Reynolds' arrest, but the ripple effects were still spreading through Riverside Gardens. The morning air was crisp as Daniel walked across the parking lot, heading to his first official meeting as part of the newly formed Resident Advisory Committee. The autumn leaves scattered across the asphalt reminded him how much time had passed since that first confrontation over a parking space. A simple dispute that had exposed a deep-rooted system of control and intimidation. The community center, once Patricia's favorite venue for issuing proclamations about parking violations, had been transformed. Gone were the threatening notices and arbitrary rules posted on every surface. Instead, the walls displayed community, announcements, local events, and a new set of clearly written, legitimate parking guidelines that had been developed with input from all residents. Maria Rodriguez met him at the door, holding a thick folder of documents. "The corporate office just sent over the final report on Patricia's activities," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and relief. "You won't believe what they found when they started digging into her financial records." Inside, the committee members were already gathering. James Chen sat reviewing documents on his tablet, while Eleanor Wilson arranged coffee and pastries on a side table. Steve Parker stood by. The whiteboard, where a detailed agenda had been written in his precise handwriting. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed, a far cry from the tense meetings that had characterized Patricia's era. "Before we begin," Steve announced as Daniel took his seat, "I think everyone should see this." He distributed copies of the corporate investigation's findings, and the room fell silent as they read through the documents. Patricia's parking enforcement scheme had been more elaborate than anyone had imagined. The investigation had uncovered a network of fake companies she had created to process her fraudulent fines, complete with offshore accounts where she had been stockpiling the money. Over the years, she had collected hundreds of thousands of dollars from residents through her unauthorized fees and penalties. She wasn't just on a power trip, Maria explained, highlighting key sections of the report. This was a sophisticated financial fraud operation. The parking enforcement was just her cover, a way to legitimize the money she was extracting from the community. Daniel studied the complex web of shell companies and bank transfers detailed in the report. She used the fear of parking violations to keep people from questioning the fees, he observed. The more afraid residents were of her authority, the less likely they were to investigate where their money was actually going. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Officer Thompson entered, accompanied by 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit. The investigation had expanded well beyond simple harassment and unauthorized parking enforcement. Ms. Reynolds is facing multiple federal charges, Thompson explained, taking a seat at the table. The parking scheme was just the tip of the iceberg. We've found similar operations at other residential complexes across 3 states. She would move in, establish herself as an authority figure, then implement her enforcement scheme to extract money from residents. The news hit the room like a thunderbolt. Patricia hadn't just been a local tyrant, she was a professional con artist who had perfected her technique over years of practice. Riverside Gardens was just her latest target, and they had been the first community to successfully expose her operation. That explains her reaction when we started documenting everything, James said, shaking his head in amazement. We weren't just threatening her control over the parking lot, we were endangering her entire criminal enterprise. Eleanor Wilson, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up with a determined expression. We need to make sure this never happens again, not just here, but anywhere. No one should have to live under that kind of fear and manipulation. The meeting shifted focus, moving from reviewing Patricia's crimes to developing new systems that would protect the community from future exploitation. Daniel found himself drawn into detailed discussions about transparency, accountability, and the importance of fostering real connections between neighbors. The interesting thing, Steve noted as they worked, is that Patricia's scheme relied on isolation. She deliberately drove wedges between residents, made everyone feel like they were alone in dealing with her harassment. The moment people started coming together, sharing information, supporting each other, that's when her power started to crumble. As they drafted new guidelines and community procedures, Daniel reflected on how much had changed. The parking lot outside was no longer a battleground, but had become a symbol of community resilience. Residents who had once hurried to their cars, afraid of drawing Patricia's attention, now stopped to chat with neighbors, shared maintenance tips, and even organized casual gatherings in the common areas. We're not just creating parking rules, Maria observed, watching Daniel's thoughtful expression. We are rebuilding trust. People need to know that they have a voice, that their concerns will be heard, that they don't have to live in fear of arbitrary punishment. The meeting continued into the afternoon, but it wasn't all serious business. There were moments of laughter as residents shared stories of their most absurd encounters with Patricia's parking enforcement regime. Eleanor Wilson had kept copies of some of the more outrageous violation notices, which now seemed almost comical in their attempts at official-sounding language. Remember the time she tried to fine someone for parking with inappropriate emotional intent? James chuckled, reading from one of the preserved notices. How do you even measure that? As they worked, more residents dropped by to contribute ideas and share their experiences. The community center became a hub of activity, filled with the kind of open dialogue and collaborative spirit that Patricia had worked so hard to suppress. A young mother who had recently moved in brought up the need for better visitor parking policies. A retired engineer offered suggestions for improving traffic flow during peak hours. Even the teenage son of one resident contributed ideas about using a simple app to help coordinate parking during community events. This is how it should be, Steve remarked during a break. Everyone having a say, working together to solve common problems. No power trips, no hidden agendas, just neighbors looking out for each other. As the afternoon wore on, Officer Thompson returned with an update that brought both closure and new challenges. Patricia's case was expanding, with investigators, discovering similar schemes at residential complexes in neighboring cities. Former victims were coming forward, sharing stories that matched the pattern they had documented at Riverside Gardens. "Your community's documentation was the key," Thompson explained. "The detailed records you kept, the way you gathered evidence, methodically instead of just reacting emotionally. It gave us the foundation we needed to uncover the broader criminal enterprise." The implications were sobering. How many other communities were still living under similar systems of fear and exploitation? How many other residents were paying fraudulent fines, afraid to challenge self-appointed authorities who seemed to hold power over their daily lives? "We need to share what we've learned," Daniel said, addressing the room. "Not just the evidence of Patricia's crimes, but the way we came together as a community to stand up to intimidation. Other people need to know they're not alone, that they can fight back against this kind of exploitation." The suggestion resonated with everyone present. They began discussing ways to reach out to other communities, to share their experiences and the lessons they had learned. The story of their parking lot rebellion could serve as a template for others facing similar situations. As they worked to finalize the new community guidelines, Daniel noticed something remarkable. The document they were creating wasn't just about parking rules and regulations. It was a statement of values, a commitment to transparency, mutual respect, and collective responsibility. Every section had been shaped by input from residents, reflecting their shared vision for a community where everyone had a voice. "You know what's really remarkable?" Maria said as they reviewed the final draft. "We're actually talking about parking, real parking issues, practical solutions, community needs, not using it as a weapon or a tool for control, but addressing it as what it is, a shared resource that we all need to manage together." The sun was setting by the time they finished, casting long shadows across the parking lot outside. As committee members gathered their things and prepared to leave, there was a sense of accomplishment that went beyond just completing a set of guidelines. They had transformed a space that had once been a source of fear and anxiety into something positive. The parking lot was no longer Patricia's kingdom of control, but had become a symbol of community empowerment and resilience. As Daniel walked to his car, he passed the spot where he had first confronted Patricia over her self-appointed authority. The memory of that confrontation felt distant now, like a story from someone else's life. In its place was a new narrative, one of neighbors coming together to protect each other, of people finding their voices and their strength in unity. His phone buzzed with a message from James. "Some residents want to organize a community gathering this weekend. Something to celebrate the new beginning. You in?" Daniel smiled as he typed his reply. The idea of a community celebration would have seemed impossible just a few months ago, when everyone lived in fear of Patricia's constant surveillance and arbitrary rules. Now it felt natural, necessary even. A way to mark the transformation from a collection of isolated individuals into a true community. The parking lot lights flickered on as dusk settled over Riverside Gardens. Cars returned from the workday, pulling into spaces without fear of violation notices or confrontations. Neighbors called out greetings to each other, stopped to chat, made plans for the weekend gathering. This was the real victory, Daniel realized, not just exposing Patricia's criminal scheme or ending her reign of terror, but rebuilding something that her years of exploitation had nearly destroyed. The simple, powerful sense of belonging to a community where people looked out for each other. As he got into his car, Daniel caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror and had to smile. He had come to Riverside Gardens looking for a quiet place to live and work, never expecting to become part of a revolution that started with a parking space and ended up transforming an entire community. The battle for the parking lot was over, but its legacy would live on in the strengthened bonds between neighbors, in the new systems of transparency and accountability, and in the story they would share with others facing similar struggles. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands, like refusing to let someone abuse their power over a parking space. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Gardens courthouse parking lot as Daniel Martinez adjusted, his tie preparing to testify in the case against Patricia Reynolds. The federal prosecution had built a strong case, but they needed witness testimony to establish the pattern of intimidation and fraud that had allowed her scheme to flourish. For so long, Steve Parker met him at the courthouse steps, briefcase in hand, looking more serious than usual. "They've found connections to organized crime," he said quietly as they walked toward the entrance. Patricia wasn't working alone. She was part of a larger network that targeted residential communities across the country. Inside the courthouse, the hallway buzzed with activity. Residents from other communities that Patricia had victimized were gathered in small groups, sharing stories that sounded eerily familiar. A woman from Oakridge Apartments described how Patricia had implemented an identical parking enforcement scheme there 3 years ago. An elderly man from Pine Valley Estates recounted losing thousands of dollars to her fraudulent fines. James Chen and Eleanor Wilson were already seated in the courtroom when Daniel arrived. They had been subpoenaed as witnesses too, their meticulous documentation of Patricia's activities forming a crucial part of the prosecution's case. Eleanor clutched her iPad, which contained months of detailed records, while James reviewed his notes one last time. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia was led in by bailiffs. She looked different now. Gone were the expensive suits and carefully maintained appearance that had been such a crucial part of her intimidation tactics. In their place was a woman in standard court attire, her face set in a mask of defiance. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, the prosecutor, Sarah Martinez, no relation to Daniel, began by laying out the scope of Patricia's operation. The simple parking enforcement scheme at Riverside Gardens had been just one part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through a network of shell companies, all tied back to similar schemes at residential communities across multiple states. The defendant, Prosecutor Martinez addressed the jury, didn't just create a fake parking enforcement operation. She systematically targeted communities, established herself as an authority figure, and then used fear and intimidation to extract money from residents who were simply trying to live their lives in peace. As Daniel waited to be called to testify, he watched Patricia's reactions carefully. She maintained a stoic expression, but her hands betrayed her anxiety, constantly adjusting and readjusting her sleeve cuffs. This wasn't the confident woman who had strutted around the parking lot issuing arbitrary fines. This was someone watching their carefully constructed world crumble under the weight of evidence. When Daniel finally took the stand, he spoke clearly and methodically, describing how the confrontation over his parking space had led to the discovery of Patricia's larger scheme. He detailed the escalating pattern of harassment, the fraudulent fines, and the way she had manipulated the community's fear to maintain control. It wasn't just about the money, he explained to the jury. The parking enforcement was a tool of control. By making people afraid to park in their own spaces, afraid to challenge her authority, she created an environment where her financial fraud could operate unchecked. The defense attorney tried to paint Daniel as a troublemaker who had stirred up unnecessary conflict in a peaceful community. But the evidence spoke for itself. The documented pattern of harassment, the fraudulent companies, the offshore accounts, where residents' money had been funneled. Throughout the testimony, Patricia's composure began to crack. When Eleanor Wilson presented her detailed records of every fraudulent fine, every incident of intimidation, Patricia's face flushed with anger when James Chen described how she had targeted vulnerable residents, those least likely to fight back. She gripped the edge of the defense table so hard her knuckles turned white. The prosecution presented financial experts who traced the money trail, showing how Patricia had built a network of fake companies to process her illegitimate fines. They revealed connections to similar schemes in other states, all following the same pattern: move in, establish control through fear, extract money through fraudulent fees, then move on when suspicion grew too strong. During a break in proceedings, Daniel overheard two FBI agents discussing the broader implications of the case. Patricia's operation had exposed a vulnerability in residential communities: the ease with which someone could establish false authority and exploit people's natural tendency to avoid conflict. The really insidious part, one agent said to the other, is how she used the community's own structure against itself. People are conditioned to respect authority, to follow rules. She exploited that basic social contract for personal gain. The trial continued for days, with more victims coming forward to share their stories. A pattern emerged that was larger than any individual community. Patricia had perfected a form of social engineering that allowed her to control entire neighborhoods. Through a combination of false authority and carefully calculated intimidation. On the fourth day of the trial, the prosecution revealed their surprise witness, one of Patricia's former associates, a man who had helped her set up similar schemes in other communities. His testimony was devastating, detailing how they had selected target communities, created fake documentation, and systematically broken down resistance through fear and manipulation. We looked for places where people were invested in their homes, their community, the associate explained. Places where residents would rather pay a fine than risk trouble. Patricia was skilled at identifying communities where people would choose compliance over confrontation. During cross-examination, Patricia's defense team tried to discredit the witness, suggesting he was testifying in exchange for leniency in his own case. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the pattern, understood the deliberate nature of the fraud, and recognized the calculated way Patricia had exploited community trust. As the trial neared its end, the atmosphere in the courthouse shifted. The fear that Patricia had once inspired was gone, replaced by a growing understanding of how she had manipulated basic human nature: the desire for order, the respect for authority, the instinct to avoid conflict, to create her criminal enterprise. The prosecutor's closing argument was powerful in its simplicity. She didn't just focus on the financial crimes, but on the human cost of Patricia's schemes. The stress inflicted on residents, the trust destroyed between neighbors, the way entire communities had been damaged by her actions. The defendant didn't just steal money, Prosecutor Martinez concluded. She stole people's sense of security in their own homes. She turned neighbor against neighbor, broke down community bonds, and exploited people's basic desire to live in peace with their neighbors. The jury deliberation was surprisingly brief. When they returned with their verdict, Patricia finally showed real emotion. As the word guilty was read out multiple times, fraud, extortion, racketeering, money laundering, her carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. The sentencing would come later, but the immediate impact was clear. As people filed out of the courtroom, there was a sense of closure, of justice being served. But there was something else too, a recognition that communities needed to protect themselves against this kind of exploitation. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to cover the verdict. Daniel found himself being approached by journalists, asking for statements, but his attention was drawn to a group of residents from other communities who had been victimized by Patricia's schemes. They weren't just there to see justice done. They wanted to learn how Riverside Gardens had fought back, how they had documented the abuse, how they had brought their community together to stand against intimidation. The story of their resistance was becoming a blueprint for other communities facing similar situations. Maria Rodriguez, who had attended every day of the trial, joined Daniel as he spoke with the group. The key, she explained, was breaking the isolation. Patricia's power came from making each person feel alone in their struggle. Once we started communicating, sharing information, supporting each other, that's when her control began to fall apart. The conversation continued long after the formal proceedings had ended. People shared contact information, made plans to create networks for sharing information about similar schemes, discussed ways to help other communities recognize and resist exploitation. As the sun began to set, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, watching groups of people still deep in discussion. The trial had ended, but something new was beginning. The exposure of Patricia's scheme had created an awareness of how vulnerable communities could be to exploitation, but it had also shown how resilience could be built through connection and mutual support. His phone buzzed with a message from James. "News channels want to do a story about how we exposed the scheme. Think we should?" Daniel thought carefully before responding. The story needed to be told, not to celebrate their victory, but to help other communities protect themselves. The parking lot battle at Riverside Gardens had uncovered something important about the nature of power and resistance in residential communities. Later that evening, as Daniel drove back to Riverside Gardens, he reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation over a parking space. The community had not just exposed a criminal enterprise, they had rediscovered their own strength, their ability to stand together against intimidation and exploitation. The parking lot lights were on when he arrived home, illuminating a space that no longer held any fear. Residents moved freely, greeting each other warmly, sharing the news of the verdict. The spirit of community that Patricia had tried so hard to destroy had not just survived, it had grown stronger through adversity. Eleanor Wilson was hosting an impromptu gathering in the community center, where residents were already discussing ways to share their experience with other communities. The story of their resistance, their methodical documentation, their unified stand against intimidation, it was becoming a resource for others facing similar challenges. "You know what's really amazing?" James said as Daniel joined the group. "We're not just talking about parking anymore. We're talking about community, about protecting each other, about standing up to people who try to use fear to control others." Steve Parker, who had been quiet most of the evening, finally spoke. The legal victory is important, but what really matters is what we learned about ourselves, about our capacity to resist intimidation when we stand together." As the evening wound down, Daniel walked through the parking lot one last time. The space that had once been Patricia's kingdom of fear now belonged to the community again. Cars were parked without anxiety. Neighbors chatted between vehicles. Children played safely under the watchful eyes of parents who no longer feared arbitrary enforcement. The battle that had started over a parking space had revealed something profound about the nature of community and resistance. Patricia's scheme had worked because she understood how to isolate people, how to use fear to break down community bonds. But in the end, those same bonds, once restored, had proved stronger than any system of control. The story of Riverside Gardens would be told not just as a cautionary tale about fraud and exploitation, but as a testament to the power of community resilience. In standing together against intimidation, they had not just exposed a criminal, they had rediscovered the fundamental strength that lies in unity and mutual support. The media attention surrounding Patricia Reynolds' conviction had brought unexpected challenges to Riverside Gardens. News vans lined the street, reporters sought interviews with residents, and curious onlookers drove slowly through the parking lot, hoping to glimpse the scene of the now famous confrontation. Daniel Martinez watched from his balcony as another television crew set up their equipment near his parking space, preparing for yet another segment about the community that had exposed a nationwide parking enforcement scam. Maria Rodriguez knocked on his door early that morning, looking exhausted but determined. "We need to talk about damage control," she said, settling into a chair with a thick folder of papers. "The corporate office is concerned about all this. Attention, they're worried it might affect property values." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. The exposure of Patricia's criminal enterprise had turned their quiet suburban community into an unwitting symbol of resistance against exploitation. While the attention had helped warn other communities about similar schemes, it had also disrupted the peace they had fought so hard to restore. "There's more," Maria continued, pulling out a series of printouts. "Other property management companies are reaching out. They want to know how we spotted the scheme, how we documented everything. Some of them suspect they might have similar operations running in their communities." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed with a message from James Chen. Another news crew had cornered him in the parking lot, pressing for details about his role in exposing Patricia's operation. The media's appetite for the story seemed insatiable, particularly after the FBI announced that the investigation had expanded to include dozens of other residential communities across the country. "We need to control this narrative," Steve Parker said later that morning as they gathered in the community center. The room, once Patricia's favorite venue for issuing proclamations, had become their de facto headquarters for handling the aftermath of her conviction. "If we don't manage this situation, the story could overshadow everything we've accomplished here." Eleanor Wilson, who had been quietly observing the discussion, finally spoke up. "Perhaps we're looking at this the wrong way," she suggested, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen communities weather various storms. "Instead of trying to minimize the attention, maybe we should use it to help other people." The idea took root quickly. Rather than hiding from the media attention, they could channel it into something constructive. Daniel began drafting a comprehensive guide detailing how they had recognized, documented, and ultimately exposed Patricia's scheme. James organized their extensive evidence into a format that other communities could use as a reference. Maria worked with the corporate office to develop official protocols for identifying and preventing similar fraudulent operations. As they worked, more stories emerged from other communities that had fallen victim to Patricia's network. A senior living complex in the next state had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars to a nearly identical scheme. A suburban development had seen long-time residents driven out by systematic harassment and fraudulent fines. Each story reinforced the importance of sharing their experience. "The really crucial part," Daniel explained to a group of visiting property managers, wasn't just documenting the fraud, it was understanding how she used fear and isolation to maintain control. Once we broke through that isolation, once people started talking to each other and sharing their experiences, her whole system began to unravel. The community center became a hub of activity, hosting workshops and information sessions for other residential communities. They shared their methods for documenting violations, explained how they had built their case, and emphasized the importance of community solidarity in facing such challenges. One afternoon, as Daniel was explaining their documentation system to a group of visiting resident representatives, he noticed something remarkable. The visitors weren't just taking notes about legal procedures and evidence gathering. They were absorbing the deeper lesson about community resilience. "It's not just about catching criminals," a visitor from another complex observed. "It's about rebuilding trust between neighbors, creating systems that promote transparency instead of fear. The observation struck a chord. While Patricia's fraud had been sophisticated, her real weapon had been the destruction of community bonds. She had created an environment where neighbors were afraid to talk to each other, where isolation and fear had replaced trust and cooperation. As the weeks passed, the media attention began to shift. The story was no longer just about a parking enforcement scam. It had evolved into a broader discussion about community vulnerability and resilience. News features focused on how Riverside Gardens had transformed from a collection of isolated residents into a united community capable of standing up to systematic exploitation. The parking lot, once Patricia's domain of fear, had become a symbol of transformation. Visitors often asked to see the space where the confrontation had begun, but what they found instead was a thriving community where neighbors chatted between cars. Children played safely, and residents moved freely without fear of arbitrary enforcement. One evening, as Daniel returned from another workshop session, he found James waiting by his parking space. "You need to see this," James said, holding up his tablet. The screen displayed dozens of messages from other communities reporting suspicious activities similar to Patricia's operation. The exposure of her scheme had created a ripple effect, encouraging people to question and investigate similar situations in their own neighborhoods. "It's like we've started something bigger than just our own community," James observed. "People are finally realizing they don't have to accept exploitation as normal." The realization led to new initiatives. Working with Steve Parker, they developed a network for communities to share information about suspicious enforcement schemes. Maria helped establish guidelines for legitimate parking management that emphasized transparency and resident involvement. Eleanor Wilson organized regular community meetings where residents could freely discuss concerns without fear of retaliation. The corporate office, initially worried about negative publicity, began to see the value in their efforts. Other properties in their portfolio implemented similar transparency measures, creating systems that encouraged community engagement rather than fear-based compliance. As summer turned to fall, the media crews gradually disappeared, but the impact of their story continued to spread. Regular emails arrived from other communities seeking advice, sharing their own experiences, or reporting successes in challenging similar schemes. One morning, Daniel arrived in the parking lot to find a small group of residents gathered around a newly installed community board. The board, a simple structure near the entrance, displayed notices about legitimate parking regulations, community events, and contact information for reporting concerns. But more importantly, it represented something Patricia had tried to destroy: open communication and transparency. "You know what's really different now?" Maria asked, joining Daniel as he examined the board. "People aren't just passing through anymore. They're stopping, talking, looking out for each other. Patricia tried to turn this space into a weapon, but we've made it into something else entirely." The observation was accurate. The parking lot had become more than just a place to leave vehicles. It was now a community space where neighbors connected, where children safely rode their bikes, where the elderly felt comfortable walking in the evenings. The very space that Patricia had used to instill fear had been reclaimed as a symbol of community strength. Late one evening, as Daniel sat on his balcony watching the usual flow of residents returning from work, he noticed something that would have been unthinkable during Patricia's reign. A new resident was having trouble parallel parking, and instead of hurrying past in fear of citation, neighbors stopped to help, offering guidance and encouragement. The scene captured everything that had changed since Patricia's scheme had been exposed. The community had not just recovered from her exploitation, it had grown stronger, more connected, more resilient. The parking lot was no longer a space of fear and control, but a place where community bonds were strengthened through daily interactions. Steve Parker joined Daniel on the balcony, watching the impromptu parking lesson below. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "we've created something that goes beyond just preventing fraud. We've shown people that community isn't just about sharing space, it's about protecting each other, standing together against exploitation." The observation resonated with something Daniel had been thinking about for weeks. While exposing Patricia's criminal enterprise had been important, the real victory was in how the community had transformed through the process. They had discovered that their greatest protection against exploitation wasn't in security systems or enforcement protocols, but in the strength of their connections with each other. As if to emphasize the point, Eleanor Wilson's voice carried up from the parking lot, where she was organizing a weekend community gathering. The events, which had become regular occurrences, were more than just social occasions. They were celebrations of the community's resilience, reminders of how far they had come from the days of living under Patricia's shadow. The sun set over Riverside Gardens, casting long shadows across the parking lot that had become the unexpected catalyst for community transformation. Cars returned home, neighbors greeted each other, and the space that had once been a source of fear continued its evolution into something Patricia could never have imagined, a symbol of community triumph over exploitation. Daniel's phone buzzed with another message from a neighboring community seeking advice about suspicious parking enforcement activities. As he began drafting a response, sharing the lessons they had learned, he realized that their story had become more than just a cautionary tale about fraud. It had become a blueprint for community resilience, a reminder that the strongest defense against exploitation is not isolation, but connection. The parking lot lights flickered on, illuminating a space that had been transformed not just physically, but symbolically. Where Patricia had seen an opportunity for control and exploitation, the community had created something entirely different. A space where trust had replaced fear, where connection had overcome isolation, and where the simple act of parking a car had become a statement of community triumph over intimidation. A crisp autumn morning brought unexpected news to Riverside Gardens. Daniel Martinez was reviewing client proposals when his phone lit up with urgent messages from multiple residents. Patricia Reynolds had been granted an appeal hearing. The news spread through the community like wildfire, stirring up memories of the fear and control that had once dominated their lives. Maria Rodriguez called an emergency meeting in the community center, where tension filled the air as residents gathered to discuss this unsettling development. The room, which had recently hosted celebrations of their community's transformation, now hummed with nervous energy as people shared their concerns. "The appeals court found a procedural issue," Steve Parker explained, standing before the assembled group. His usually calm demeanor showed signs of strain as he detailed the legal technicality that had opened this new chapter in their ongoing saga. "They're questioning the admissibility of some of our electronic evidence." The news hit hard. Much of their case against Patricia had relied on digital documentation, emails, security footage, and electronic records of her fraudulent fines. If the appeals court found issues with how this evidence had been collected and presented, it could potentially undermine the entire conviction. James Chen, who had been instrumental in gathering much of the technical evidence, spoke up from the back of the room. "What exactly are they questioning? We followed every protocol, documented everything meticulously." Steve shuffled through his legal papers, adjusting his glasses. "Patricia's new legal team is arguing that some of our security camera footage was obtained without proper authorization. They're also challenging the authenticity of the electronic communications we presented." Eleanor Wilson, who had been quietly taking notes on her iPad, raised her hand. "But we have the original files, the timestamps, everything. Surely they can't just dismiss all of that." The discussion continued as residents grappled with the implications of this development. The community that had fought so hard to expose Patricia's scheme now faced the possibility of having to defend their actions all over again. Officer Thompson arrived midway through the meeting, bringing additional information from the prosecution team. "This isn't unusual in cases involving complex financial fraud," he assured the worried residents. "Appeals are part of the process. What matters is how we respond." Daniel observed the room, noting how the mere mention of Patricia's name had brought back shadows of the old fear. But there was something different now. Beneath the anxiety, he saw determination. This community had changed too much to simply surrender to old fears. "We need to be proactive," Daniel finally spoke, standing to address the group. "Instead of waiting for the appeals process to play out, we should strengthen our case. There must be other communities affected by Patricia's scheme who haven't come forward yet." The suggestion sparked a new energy in the room. Residents began organizing into teams, each focusing on different aspects of building their defense. James would lead a group in reviewing and reinforcing the technical documentation. Eleanor and her network of senior residents would reach out to other communities where Patricia had operated. Maria worked with the corporate office to obtain additional records of Patricia's activities across different properties. The paper trail of her operations went deeper than they had initially realized, revealing patterns of behavior that strengthened their case against her. As the community mobilized, something remarkable happened. The fear that had initially resurfaced, with news of the appeal, began to transform into renewed purpose. Residents who had remained quiet during the first trial started coming forward with new information, memories they had suppressed during Patricia's reign of terror. A young mother described how Patricia had used parking violations to harass her after she complained about unauthorized surveillance of her children playing in the lot. An elderly resident revealed documents from years ago showing similar schemes Patricia had attempted to implement in other communities. The parking lot, which had briefly tensed under the shadow of Patricia's possible return, became a hub of activity as residents worked together to strengthen their case. People gathered between cars, sharing stories, comparing notes, building a more complete picture of the systematic exploitation they had endured. Steve Parker set up a temporary legal advisory station in the community center, helping residents properly document their experiences and ensure all evidence met strict legal standards. The appeals court needs to see not just what Patricia did, but how her actions impacted real people, real lives, he explained. The corporate office, having learned from the initial case, provided full access to their records. Security footage that hadn't been considered relevant during the first trial revealed additional instances of Patricia's enforcement activities, strengthening the pattern of systematic exploitation. Officer Thompson brought news that other law enforcement agencies had opened investigations into similar schemes in their jurisdictions. Patricia's operation had been more extensive than anyone had initially realized, and each new discovery added weight to their case. Late one evening, as Daniel reviewed the growing mountain of evidence with James and Maria, a pattern emerged that they hadn't noticed before. Patricia's parking enforcement scheme hadn't just been about extracting money from residents. It had been a sophisticated system of social control, using parking regulations as a means to monitor and manipulate community behavior. "Look at this," James said, pulling up a series of dated photographs. She strategically targeted certain residents first, usually people who were active in the community, who might have questioned her authority. Once she broke them down, the others fell in line more easily. Maria nodded, adding her own observations. The timing of her escalations wasn't random either. she would increase pressure on some residents while easing up on others, creating divisions, preventing people from recognizing the pattern of abuse. This revelation led to a new approach in preparing for the appeal. Instead of just defending their evidence collection methods, they would demonstrate the systematic nature of Patricia's operation, how she had deliberately crafted a climate of fear and isolation to facilitate her fraud. Eleanor Wilson organized a timeline, mapping out how Patricia had gradually expanded her control over the community. The visual representation was striking, showing how small incidents of parking enforcement had grown into a complex web of intimidation and financial exploitation. The community's response to the appeal threat had another unexpected effect. It brought forward witnesses from other properties where Patricia had operated. People who had remained silent out of fear began reaching out, sharing similar stories of systematic harassment and fraudulent fines. A property manager from a neighboring county arrived one afternoon with boxes of documents, records of Patricia's activities that had been buried in storage for years. The papers revealed a clear progression, showing how she had refined her techniques over time, learning from each community how to make her schemes more effective. As the appeal date approached, Riverside Gardens had transformed once again. The initial fear of Patricia's possible return had galvanized the community into action, strengthening the bonds that her scheme had once tried to destroy. Residents worked together with renewed purpose, determined to protect not just their own community, but others who might face similar exploitation. Steve Parker, reviewing their reinforced case, smiled for the first time since the appeal news broke. "You know what's remarkable," he said to Daniel. "Patricia's appeal might actually help expose the full scope of her operations. We've uncovered more in the past few weeks than we did during the entire first trial." The parking lot, once Patricia's domain of fear, had become a symbol of community resilience once again. Residents moved freely, sharing information, supporting each other's efforts to strengthen their case. The space that Patricia had used to control people now served as a gathering place for those working to ensure her schemes could never take root again. One evening, as Daniel watched the usual flow of residents returning home, he noticed something significant. People weren't just parking their cars and hurrying inside anymore. They were stopping to chat, sharing updates about the appeal preparation, offering support and encouragement. The very activity Patricia had tried to suppress, community connection, had become stronger in the face of her potential return. Maria joined him, observing the scene. "You know what's different this time?" she asked. "People aren't afraid anymore. They're angry, yes, and concerned about the appeal, but the fear is gone. They know their strength now." The observation was accurate. The community that Patricia had once controlled through isolation and fear had found its collective voice. Each resident who shared their story, each piece of evidence they uncovered, added to a powerful narrative of resistance and recovery. As the sun set over Riverside Gardens, casting long shadows across the parking lot, Daniel reflected on how far they had come. The appeal threat, instead of reinstating old fears, had reinforced their determination to protect what they had built. Patricia's attempt to challenge their victory had only served to make their community stronger. His phone buzzed with another message. More residents from another of Patricia's former properties had come forward, ready to share their experiences. The story of Riverside Gardens' resistance had given them the courage to break their silence, to add their voices to the growing testimony against systematic exploitation. The parking lot lights flickered on, illuminating a space that held new meaning. Where Patricia had once seen an opportunity for control, the community had created something she could never truly understand, a place where connection overcame fear, where solidarity defeated isolation, and where the simple act of parking a car had become a statement of freedom from intimidation. The battle wasn't over, but Riverside Gardens was ready. They had learned that true security came not from cameras or regulations, but from the strength of a community united against exploitation. Patricia's appeal had taught them one final lesson, that the victory they had won wasn't just about exposing a criminal scheme, but about protecting the bonds of community that made such schemes impossible to maintain. The morning of the appeal, hearing dawned grey and cold, a fitting atmosphere for what promised to be an intense legal battle. Daniel Martinez stood in the courthouse parking lot, watching as residents from multiple communities arrived to show their support. The case had grown far beyond Riverside Gardens now, touching lives across several states where Patricia Reynolds had implemented her schemes. FBI agent Sarah Collins met them outside the courthouse, carrying thick files of new evidence. "We've uncovered connections to organized crime," she explained as they walked toward the entrance. Patricia wasn't just running parking scams. The money was being funneled into larger criminal enterprises. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Patricia's new legal team, far more sophisticated than her previous defenders, had arranged an impressive array of technical experts. They were prepared to challenge every piece of digital evidence, every recorded conversation, every security camera footage that had led to her conviction. Steve Parker organized their witnesses, ensuring each testimony would build upon the last to create a comprehensive picture of Patricia's operations. "Remember," he advised the group, "they're going to try to make this about technical details, about procedures. We need to keep the focus on the human impact of her schemes." The proceedings began with Patricia's lead attorney, Michael Richardson, presenting their appeal strategy. He spoke eloquently about proper evidence collection, procedures, about digital authenticity, about the rights of property managers to implement security measures. His arguments were technically sound, designed to create doubt about the methods used to expose Patricia's operation. But then the testimony began, and the true scope of Patricia's activities started to emerge. A forensic accountant detailed how she had created a complex network of shell companies to process her fraudulent fines. The money trail led through offshore accounts, revealing connections to larger criminal organizations that used residential communities as laundering operations. Eleanor Wilson took the stand, her iPad filled with meticulously documented incidents from multiple communities. Her testimony wasn't just about parking violations and false fines. It painted a picture of systematic social manipulation, showing how Patricia had used fear and isolation to maintain control. "It wasn't just about the money," Eleanor explained. To the court, she created a system where neighbors were afraid to talk to each other, where any sign of resistance was met with escalating harassment. The parking enforcement was just her tool for maintaining control. James Chen presented enhanced security footage showing patterns of targeted harassment. The technical evidence that Patricia's team had tried to discredit actually revealed a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Residents who questioned her authority found themselves subject to increased surveillance, multiple violations, and strategic pressure designed to force compliance or departure. Throughout the testimony, Patricia sat with her legal team, her expression carefully neutral. But Daniel, watching closely, noticed how she reacted to certain revelations. When witnesses from other communities described identical schemes she had implemented years ago, her composure briefly cracked. When financial records revealed the full scope of her operation, her hands trembled slightly. The breakthrough came during cross-examination of a technical expert. Patricia's team had called Dr. Marcus Weber, a digital forensics specialist, to challenge the authenticity of electronic communications used in the original trial. But as he examined the evidence more closely, he found something unexpected. "These patterns," Dr. Weber said, studying the data, They're not random. The timing of enforcement actions, the selection of targets, the escalation of pressure, it shows clear algorithmic design. Someone created a systematic approach to maximizing financial extraction while minimizing resistance. The revelation shifted the entire focus of the appeal. What had started as a challenge to evidence collection procedures had exposed an even more sophisticated criminal enterprise. Patricia hadn't just been implementing random schemes. She had developed a calculated system for identifying vulnerable communities and exploiting their social dynamics. Agent Collins requested a brief recess, during which she shared new information with the prosecution team. The FBI had discovered similar algorithms being used in other criminal operations, suggesting Patricia's methods had been adopted by larger organizations specializing in community-based fraud. When court resumed, the prosecution presented evidence showing how Patricia's parking enforcement scheme had been refined through multiple iterations. Each community she targeted had helped her perfect her techniques, learning which pressure points were most effective, which residents were most vulnerable to intimidation. Maria Rodriguez testified about the lasting impact on community trust. Even after we exposed her scheme, it took months for people to feel safe talking to their neighbors again, she explained. She didn't just steal money, she destroyed the basic fabric of community life. The appeal hearing had transformed into something larger than a challenge to the original conviction. It was revealing how sophisticated criminal enterprises could exploit the basic human desire for order and security, turning community regulations into tools of control and exploitation. During a lunch break, Daniel overheard two FBI agents discussing the broader implications of the case. "This goes beyond parking enforcement," one said. "It's a blueprint for how criminal organizations can infiltrate and control residential communities. The money laundering is almost secondary to the social control aspects." The afternoon session brought testimony from technical experts who had analyzed Patricia's methods. They described how she had selected her targets, choosing communities with specific demographic profiles and management structures that made them vulnerable to her schemes. The parking enforcement was just the visible part, explained Dr. Sandra Chen, a specialist in organizational behavior. The real sophistication was in how she manipulated social dynamics. She created systems where residents would enforce her, rules for her, where the community itself became complicit in its own exploitation. As the hearing continued, more patterns emerged. Patricia's operation hadn't just been about collecting fraudulent fines. It was about creating self-sustaining systems of control that could operate with minimal direct oversight. She had turned parking lots into laboratories for testing methods of social manipulation. The evidence presented showed how she had used basic human psychology against her victims. The desire to avoid conflict, the respect for authority, the fear of standing out, all these natural human tendencies had been weaponized to maintain control over entire communities. Steve Parker's closing argument brought together all the threads of testimony. He showed how Patricia's schemes had evolved from simple parking enforcement scams into sophisticated systems of community control. The financial fraud was significant, but the real crime had been the deliberate destruction of community bonds to facilitate that fraud. As the final day of the appeal hearing drew to a close, the impact of the revelations was clear. Patricia's attempt to challenge her conviction had instead exposed the full scope of her operations, revealing a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond parking enforcement schemes. The judges retired to consider their decision, leaving the courtroom buzzing with discussion about the broader implications of the case. Law enforcement agencies were already beginning to investigate similar operations in other communities, using the patterns exposed in Patricia's case as a guide. Outside the courthouse, Daniel found himself surrounded by residents from other communities where Patricia had operated. They weren't just there to see justice maintained. They were there to understand how to prevent similar schemes from taking root in their neighborhoods. Maria organized an impromptu gathering in a nearby coffee shop where people shared stories and strategies for rebuilding community trust. The appeal hearing had brought together people from different communities, all united by their experience, with Patricia's schemes and their determination to prevent future exploitation. As evening approached, Steve Parker received word that the judges had reached their decision. The appeal was denied, but more importantly, the hearing had led to expanded investigations into similar operations across the country. Patricia's attempt to challenge her conviction had only served to strengthen the case against her and expose the broader criminal enterprise she had helped create. The parking lot at Riverside Gardens was full when Daniel returned home that evening. Residents had gathered spontaneously, not out of fear or obligation, but to celebrate another victory over the system of control that had once dominated their lives. Eleanor Wilson had set up her iPad to share photos from the different communities where Patricia had operated, showing how similar spaces had been transformed from zones of fear into places of community connection. The patterns were clear. Once the exploitation was exposed, communities naturally rebuilt their bonds stronger than before. As night fell, the parking lot lights illuminated a scene that would have been impossible during Patricia's reign. Children played between the cars while parents chatted nearby. Elderly residents walked freely, greeting neighbors without fear of arbitrary enforcement. The space that had once been a tool of control had been fully reclaimed as a center of community life. James Chen, reviewing the day's events with Daniel, summed up what they had learned. The appeal showed us something important. It's not enough to just expose these schemes. We need to understand how they work, how they exploit community dynamics. That's the only way to prevent them from happening again. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone. Patricia's appeal had failed to overturn her conviction, but it had succeeded in revealing the true sophistication of community-based fraud operations. The knowledge gained would help protect other communities from similar exploitation, turning her attempt to escape justice into a tool for preventing future crimes. The winter morning brought a hush over Riverside Gardens, snow blanketing the now peaceful parking lot in pristine white. Daniel Martinez stood at his window, coffee in hand, reflecting on how this ordinary space had become the catalyst for exposing a nationwide criminal enterprise. His quiet contemplation was interrupted by an urgent message from Officer Thompson that would bring their story full circle. "Got something you need to see," Thompson's message read. Patricia's operation wasn't just about parking enforcement. "We found connections to a larger network, and you won't believe who's involved." Within the hour, Daniel found himself in the community center, surrounded by the familiar faces who had fought alongside him in their battle against Patricia's reign of terror. Maria Rodriguez, James Chen, Eleanor Wilson, and Steve Parker gathered around a table covered with new evidence as Officer Thompson and FBI Agent Collins laid out their discoveries. Patricia's scheme was just the tip of the iceberg, Agent Collins explained, spreading photographs and documents across the table. "We've uncovered a sophisticated network of similar operations across multiple states, all using variations of her methods. But here's the twist. They're being run by someone you all know." The agent pushed forward a surveillance photo that made everyone at the table freeze. There, clearly shown entering a high-rise office building, was Thomas Reynolds, Patricia's brother and the former property manager who had originally approved her unofficial parking enforcement position at several complexes. "He's been running a consulting firm," Thompson continued, "teaching other criminals how to implement these schemes in different communities. They've learned from Patricia's mistakes, making their operations harder to detect and legally challenging to stop. The revelation hit hard. What had started as one woman's power trip in their parking lot had evolved into a systematic approach to community exploitation, refined and commercialized by her own family. The snow falling outside seemed to emphasize the chilling nature of their discovery. James immediately pulled up his laptop, accessing records from their original investigation. "Look at this," he said, pointing to timestamps and patterns they had previously overlooked. The escalation of Patricia's scheme coincides with her brother's business trips. He was using our community as a testing ground for his wider operation. Steve Parker began reviewing legal documents with fresh eyes. The corporate structures they're using now are incredibly sophisticated, he noted. Shell companies within. Shell companies, all technically legal, but designed to obscure their true purpose. They've turned Patricia's crude methods into a science. Eleanor Wilson, who had maintained contact with other affected communities, started receiving messages confirming the pattern. "It's happening everywhere," she reported, her iPad filling with new reports. "But they're smarter now. They use legitimate-looking companies, professional enforcement officers, proper paperwork. It's Patricia's playbook, just polished and perfected." As they dug deeper into the evidence, Maria noticed something significant about the timing. These operations target communities at specific moments, usually during management transitions or after major resident turnover. They slip in during periods of change when people are less likely to question new authorities. Daniel recognized the corporate strategy at play. "They're treating community exploitation like a business franchise," he explained, standardizing the methods, creating reproducible systems, even offering training and support to new operators. It's Patricia's scheme turned into a business model. The storm outside intensified as they worked through the evidence, the howling wind a fitting soundtrack to their growing understanding of the threat they faced. The parking lot below, barely visible through the swirling snow, seemed to remind them of how ordinary spaces could become battlegrounds for control. Agent Collins brought in additional files showing how Thomas Reynolds had systematized his sister's methods. "He's created what he calls community compliance consulting," she explained. "On paper, it looks legitimate, helping properties manage parking and resident behavior. But in reality, it's a blueprint for systematic exploitation." The group worked through the night, fueled by coffee and determination, mapping out the network they had uncovered. James created digital models, showing how the schemes had evolved, becoming more sophisticated with each implementation. "They're using AI now," he noted grimly. "Algorithms to identify vulnerable communities and optimize their pressure points." Steve Parker discovered a disturbing legal trend in the documentation. "They've created a maze of contracts and agreements," he explained. "Residents unknowingly sign away their rights to challenge the enforcement through buried clauses and legal jargon. It's brilliant and terrifying." As dawn approached, Eleanor organized their findings into a comprehensive report. "We need to share this," she insisted, "not just with law enforcement, but with every residential community in the country. People need to know what to look for before these operations take root." Maria began coordinating with property management companies, developing guidelines to help them recognize and resist these sophisticated schemes. "The key is transparency," she emphasized. "These operations can't survive if communities stay connected and informed." The snow finally began to ease as they formulated their response strategy. Officer Thompson and Agent Collins were already coordinating with federal authorities, preparing to move against Thomas Reynolds' organization, but they all knew that legal action alone wouldn't be enough. "We need to build community resilience," Daniel said, addressing the group as morning. Light began to filter through the windows. "These schemes work because they exploit isolation and fear. The best defense is creating connections they can't break. The next few weeks saw intense activity across Riverside Gardens and beyond. James developed a secure communication network, linking residential communities across the country, allowing them to share information about suspicious enforcement activities. Eleanor organized workshops teaching residents how to recognize and resist manipulation attempts. Maria worked with property managers to implement transparency protocols that would make it harder for exploitative schemes to take hold. The parking lot became a symbol of their renewed purpose. Where Patricia had once used it to instill fear, it now served as a gathering place for community organizing and education. Residents from other communities visited regularly, learning from their experience and sharing their own stories of resistance. The federal investigation into Thomas Reynolds' operation moved swiftly, building on the foundation of evidence they had gathered. One by one, his fake consulting firms were exposed, their connections to Patricia's original scheme revealed. But more importantly, communities began recognizing and rejecting these exploitation attempts before they could take root. Steve Parker helped draft new legal guidelines for residential properties, specifically designed to prevent the abuse of parking enforcement authority. "We're not just fighting individual schemes anymore," he explained to a group of property managers. "We're changing the system that makes them possible." As winter began to thaw, news came that Thomas Reynolds had been arrested, along with several of his associates. The network he had built was crumbling as communities across the country implemented the protective measures developed at Riverside Gardens. Daniel stood in the parking lot one evening, watching residents come and go freely, without fear or hesitation. The space that had once been a battleground for control had become a testament to community resilience. See, children played between the parked cars, neighbors stopped to chat, and the atmosphere of anxiety that had once permeated the area was replaced by a sense of shared purpose. Maria joined him, carrying fresh reports from other communities that had successfully resisted implementation of control schemes. "It's amazing," she said, "how something that started with one parking space led to all of this." The story of Riverside Gardens had evolved from a simple tale of standing up to a local tyrant into a blueprint for community empowerment. Their experience had shown that the strongest defense against exploitation wasn't just legal action or security measures. It was the bonds between neighbors, the shared commitment to protecting their community. James Chen, who had once focused solely on technical evidence, now spent his time teaching other communities how to recognize digital patterns of manipulation. "Technology can be used to control people," he would explain in his workshops, "but it can also be used to connect and protect them." Eleanor Wilson's network of senior residents had become a powerful early warning system, sharing information about suspicious activities and supporting communities facing similar challenges. "We're not just victims anymore," she would tell new groups. "We're guardians of our communities." The winter's snow had melted away, revealing a transformed landscape. The parking lot that had once been Patricia's domain of fear now served as a model for other communities learning to protect themselves. Regular gatherings brought residents together, strengthening the connections that made exploitation impossible. As spring approached, Daniel received one final update from Agent Collins. The investigation had led to the exposure of similar operations across the country, each one dismantled using the methods they had developed at Riverside Gardens. The simple act of standing up to one person's abuse of power had sparked a nationwide movement of community resistance. The parking lot at Riverside Gardens remained an ordinary space. Cars came and went, residents lived their lives, children played. But it had become something more, a symbol of how ordinary people working together could overcome systematic exploitation and build something stronger in its place. And if you're wondering what happens when communities stand together against intimidation. Just look around your own neighborhood. The next chapter might be waiting to unfold in your own parking lot. Up next, two more incredible stories that will change how you see everyday places. These aren't just stories. They're blueprints for standing up to injustice in your own community.